Early in the afternoon on June 5th, 2007, northern Victoria sat under clear winter skies, the air cool and still, with long stretches of farmland lying quiet beneath the sun, while traffic moved steadily along the Murray Valley Highway, passing irrigation channels, open paddocks, and small rural properties that gave little sense of urgency or danger. Nearby, a vline passenger train made its routine southbound journey from Swan Hill toward Melbourne, a service that ran almost every day, carrying just over 30 passengers who had settled into their seats, expecting nothing more than a familiar country trip, some traveling for medical appointments in larger towns, others visiting family, and a few simply heading into the city as they had many times before. Inside the train, the mood was calm and ordinary, with passengers reading, talking quietly, or gazing out at the passing landscape, while the diesel locomotive pulled 3 carriages across the flat terrain at a steady pace, staying on schedule and operating well within normal conditions, as neither crew nor passengers had any reason to believe that this journey would be any different from countless others that had come before it. Ahead on the route lay a level crossing just north of the small town of Kerang, a crossing that looked unremarkable to anyone unfamiliar with its later history, consisting of a single rail line intersecting a 2-lane highway, protected by flashing red lights, warning bells, painted road markings, and standard signage, but without boom gates, a design that had been common across regional Australia for decades and had functioned without serious incident at this location for years, encouraging a sense of routine for locals and professional drivers alike who passed through daily. For truck drivers in particular, the crossing was a familiar landmark rather than a perceived hazard, one of many encountered along long rural routes. And for trains, it was simply another point where road and rail briefly intersected before continuing on their separate paths, a system that relied not on physical barriers, but on attention, timing, and compliance with warning signals to keep both sides safe. As the train approached Kerang, its driver followed established procedure, sounding the horn well in advance, while the crossing protection activated exactly as designed, red lights beginning to flash and warning bells ringing out across the open fields, signaling clearly to approaching vehicles that a train was coming and that traffic was required to slow and stop. From the locomotive cab, the driver could see the highway running roughly parallel to the track before curving inward toward the crossing, a view that allowed approaching traffic to be observed from a distance. In that view, a northbound semi-trailer appeared, fully loaded and traveling at highway speed, something that initially gave no cause for alarm, as trains and heavy vehicles crossed paths at this location countless times without incident. And under normal circumstances, the expectation was simple. The truck would reduce speed, come to a stop behind the marked line, and wait for the train to pass. But as the distance closed, the situation began to feel wrong, because despite the flashing lights and ringing bells, the truck showed no obvious sign of slowing, and with each passing second, the margin for error shrank rapidly, turning what should have been a routine crossing into a developing emergency, as the train continued forward with limited ability to alter its path or speed. Realizing that the truck was not stopping, the train driver applied the brakes and then moved quickly into emergency braking, leaning hard on the horn in a final effort to draw the truck driver's attention, knowing that a fully loaded semi-trailer traveling at speed could not simply stop instantly, and that the train itself, bound to its tracks and carrying passengers, had very few options left as the crossing rushed toward them. In the final moments before impact, time collapsed into instinct. As the truck continued toward the crossing and the train surged forward with no room left to escape, the locomotive and first carriage reaching the road just ahead of the collision point, while the driver could do nothing more than hold the brake and brace, and in a split second, The semi-trailer veered slightly, as if attempting to pass behind the engine, narrowly missing it before smashing into the side of the second carriage with enormous force, followed almost immediately by a second impact that tore into the third carriage, ripping steel panels open, shattering windows, and flinging debris across the highway and surrounding paddocks as the sound of tearing metal and breaking glass echoed across the flat farmland. Inside the train, the transition from routine travel to disaster was instant and violent, with passengers hurled from their seats, slammed into walls, or crushed beneath collapsing fittings. As seats tore loose from the floor, luggage became airborne, and daylight poured through ruptured sides of the carriages, leaving some passengers trapped in twisted wreckage, while others, stunned and bleeding, stumbled into the open, struggling to understand what had just happened. The locomotive and leading carriage remained upright, and as the train came to a halt beyond the crossing, the driver immediately radioed a mayday, while at the same time, survivors and passing motorists began calling emergency services, their voices fractured by shock, as smoke and dust drifted upward from the wreck and the once quiet highway filled with the sound of sirens approaching from every direction. Local residents, drawn by the impact and the sight of wreckage scattered across the road and fields, arrived within minutes, finding scenes of devastation they were wholly unprepared for, as injured passengers lay among torn metal and broken glass, while others tried desperately to help strangers, hold pressure on wounds, or comfort those too injured to move, long before professional responders could reach them. Firefighters, paramedics, police, and air ambulance crews soon took over, establishing triage zones along the highway and in nearby paddocks, carefully prioritizing the injured, cutting survivors free from crushed carriages, and coordinating helicopter evacuations to hospitals in Swan Hill, Bendigo, and Melbourne, while the highway was shut down and the rail line severed, turning the crash site into a sprawling emergency zone that would remain active for days. Despite the speed and scale of the response, the damage had already been done, and by the time the last victims were accounted for, 11 passengers, including several children, had lost their lives, with more than a dozen others injured. A toll that marked the incident as Australia's deadliest rail disaster in decades and sent shockwaves through communities across regional Victoria and beyond. In the weeks that followed, investigators from Victoria's Office of the Chief Investigator, supported by the Australian Transport Safety Bureau, examined every aspect of the crash, from the train's operation and braking data to the condition of the track, the crossing equipment, the truck, the weather, and the sight lines, ultimately finding that the train had been traveling within permitted limits, the warning lights and bells had activated correctly, and there was no mechanical failure that could explain the collision. The conclusion was stark and deeply uncomfortable, because with the systems functioning as designed, responsibility rested on a single human decision, as investigators determined that the truck driver failed to stop in response to active warnings for reasons that could never be fully explained, a finding that later resulted in a not guilty verdict in court, leaving many families feeling that accountability had dissolved into technicalities rather than answers. A long coronial inquest followed, widening its focus beyond Kerang to examine level crossing safety across Victoria, ultimately producing dozens of recommendations aimed at reducing risk, including the expanded use of boom gates, improved warning systems, better data collection on near misses, enhanced driver education for heavy vehicles, and stronger emergency response planning, changes that reshape policy and infrastructure across the state. At the Kerang crossing itself, physical upgrades were installed, trains returned to service, and traffic resumed. But the sense of loss never truly left, as each anniversary brought families back to the site to read names, light candles, and remember the lives that ended there. While for the rail and road industries alike, the disaster became a lasting case study in the limits of technology and the consequences of momentary inattention. A reminder that even on a clear day, on a straight road, with lights flashing and bells ringing, safety ultimately depends on a single decision to stop.